All right, today we're diving into a real puzzle coming out of Connecticut. There's this new farm bill, SB 435, and on the surface, it's all about helping farmers. But if you dig just a little deeper, you start to see that the real story isn't about what the law says. It's about the subtle, yet really powerful shifts it's creating just beneath the surface.
And this really gets us to the heart of the mystery. You see, for decades, Connecticut's system for protecting farms, well, it was working just fine. There wasn't some big crisis, no major failure that everyone was talking about. So the big question is, why pass a new bill to fix something that wasn't broken? That's what we're going to unpack here.
Okay, to really solve this puzzle, we've got to go back a bit. Let's take a look at the way things were before this new bill came along. What exactly was this old system that, by all accounts, was doing its job?
So the old system was basically built on these four key pillars, and they created a pretty good balance. You had right to farm laws, which were there to protect farmers from, nuisance lawsuits. Then there was this really successful tax program called PA 490 that helped keep farmland affordable. And this is the crucial part, power was kept local. Disputes were handled by towns and courts on a case-by-case basis with people who actually understood the local community.
And look, at the end of the day, the system worked. Simple as that. It preserved farmland, it kept family farms running, and it was flexible enough to adapt over time. The big takeaway here from the source material is that there was no documented statewide failure that screamed, we need a major overhaul.
So into this perfectly functional system, along comes this new bill, SB 435. Now, it doesn't just throw out all the old rules. Instead, it does something much more subtle, and, as we'll see, much more significant. It changes how the game is played.
And you can really see the fundamental shift here. The old way was all about being local and flexible. Power was spread out among different groups. But the new way, under this bill, is centralized and uniform. All that authority starts to get consolidated at the state level, and decisions are now guided by these big statewide standards instead of local context.
So you're probably wondering, how does this shift actually happen? Well, it's all in the details, the fine print. For example, approvals from a state agency now become what's called prima facie evidence. That's a legal term that basically means they're assumed to be correct, which makes it way harder for a local town to challenge them. On top of that, state rules can now override local zoning, and even the very definition of what counts as an accepted agricultural practice gets decided more centrally.
So when you boil all those little details down, the crucial point is really simple. The power to make the big decisions, to define what is and isn't farming, has been shifted. It's moved upward, away from local communities and courts and into the hands of a central state authority.
Now, it's easy to think this is just some unique situation happening in Connecticut, but it's not. This kind of shift is actually part of a very familiar, almost predictable pattern in how government policy tends to evolve over time.
It usually happens in about 4 phases. It almost always starts with a simple, good idea, right? Hey, we need to protect our farms. Okay, great. But then, to make it fair for everyone, you have to move to standardization. All right, let's clarify which practices actually qualify for this protection. And from there, the next logical step is centralization. You know what? Let's just make these approvals uniform across the whole state. And that is what sets the stage for the final phase, which often doesn't come until later. Conditioning, which sounds like, okay, to get all these protections, you now must do X, Y, and Z.
And it is absolutely essential to get this next point. This whole evolution, it doesn't require some villain in a back room or a grand conspiracy. It's just a natural, logical way that administrative systems evolve. They grow, they seek efficiency, they want uniformity. Each individual step, when you look at it in isolation, makes perfect sense.
Okay, so we've seen this big, abstract policy pattern. But what does a shift in authority actually mean for the people on the ground, for the farmers themselves? Well, this brings us to what we could call the farmer's dilemma.
Just think about your classic independent family farm for a second. They're usually operating on a smaller scale. They might rely on a mix of informal or different practices. A lot of the time, their biggest asset isn't a team of lawyers. It's their local relationships, their reputation in the community. They don't have a huge staff for navigating complex regulations. And this is exactly where that policy shift hits home. As soon as the system becomes more standardized, more centralized, what happens? Well, compliance costs start to rise. The flexibility that those small farms absolutely depend on, it starts to disappear. And all of a sudden, the whole game is tilted in favor of the larger operations, the ones who have the resources to handle all this new administrative paperwork.
And this really gets to the core tension of the whole thing, which is captured perfectly in this quote from our source.
The land stays green. The farmer may not stay independent. The policies might succeed in preserving the agricultural landscape, but the actual person working that land might not be able to stay in business on their own.
Which brings us to really the central insight of this whole analysis. We talk all the time about saving farms, but we hardly ever stop to ask a really crucial follow-up question. And the key takeaway is this: protecting farmland is not the same thing as protecting independent farmers. These are two completely different goals, and a policy that's designed to do one can, sometimes without anyone meaning to, actually harm the other.
So this forces us to shift our perspective, right? The most important question isn't just about what the bill says today, it's about looking down the road. What does putting this new centralized structure in place make it easier for policymakers to require 5, 10, or even 20 years from now?
Because once you have that central system, it's so much easier to start adding new layers on top of it. You're talking about things like mandatory reporting requirements, specific performance standards for, say, soil health or water usage, or brand new conditions a farm has to meet just to be eligible for any protection at all. And this is the long-term trend that we see play out time and time again. When authority moves upward and the rules become centralized, yeah, the land itself is often preserved. It stays green. But ownership and control, they tend to quietly consolidate over time, shifting away from those independent families and toward bigger and bigger operations.
So, we're left with a really important question. The goal here isn't to be for or against protecting farms. Of course we want to protect them. It's about being smart about it. How can we design policies that actually protect our agricultural land without accidentally putting the entire future of independent farmers at risk? Now that is a puzzle worth solving.